With it being the 24th anniversary of the September 11th attacks here in the United States, we decided to start our show a little bit differently and welcoming in a pretty familiar face to many of you at home. Joe LaFurgey is our assistant news director now, but he used to be a reporter here. Some of you may remember some of his incredible stories. Well, he decided to stop in and talk about that fateful day and what it was like not only being here in Grand Rapids, so far away from where those attacks had occurred, but also working as a journalist and having so many questions themselves, but then also needing to be the one to provide those answers to so many people here, not just in West Michigan, but across the country. Joe was kind enough to join us, and here is that conversation now. Joe, it is so good to see you again. Thank you so much for stopping by. And obviously, on a pretty important day in American history, 24 years ago, the September 11th attacks happened across the country, left a lot of people asking a lot of different questions, not just on that day, but really for a long, long time. And people were really kind of relying on local journalists and journalists all across the country to really provide those answers. And that's why we wanted to bring you on, Joe, today, because you, as well as our incredible team here at Newsday, probably had a very eventful day leading up to that. And you actually had a pretty interesting tale about how that day even got started. If you wouldn't mind, let's just start off there of just, before the attacks even happened, before our world really at large kind of changed. I mean, what was that day sort of like for you?
Phil, we hear it 1,000 times. Every documentary you've ever seen on 9/11 starts out, it was a beautiful sunny day in New York, and it was the same here. Quiet day. We were the city commission had a primary election that day for 2 or 3 seats on the city commission. I covered City Hall, so I was going to work the night shift to cover those elections and get the results. So I was home doing some stuff around the house. I was headed to the hardware store and I had the radio on, and all of a sudden one of the DJs on the station I was listening to said, "Oh, this is not right." And that was when when the first plane hit, and they were starting to come along with, okay, this doesn't seem like an accident. So the more knowledge I got, I never made it to the hardware store. I turned the car around and came home and started turning on the networks and watching the coverage. And the second plane hit, and you knew that we were under attack. I spent part of the morning. I called the newsroom. They didn't want me to come in right away. Which is tough on somebody who's been in news, and
Right.
Eventually I ignored what they were telling me and came in anyway. It's kind of in the DNA, of news people to do that. But in the meantime, I'm on the phone with my wife. She had just started teaching. She had switched careers and was a brand new teacher at a high school in the area. And she said, well, we're not going to show the kids any of this. We're not sure how to handle it. But her biggest concern was our children. We're all in elementary school at the time. And what do we do with them? And I told her, I said, I think the safest place for them right now is at school. That was a question parents across the country were asking each other at that moment. It was frightening. I had made a call because I knew my sister was out of town traveling to see if she'd gotten back or if she was on her way back. Was able to get a hold of her. And at one point I said, I'm going in. I'm going to go into the work. And got here. One of the challenges in our newsroom at the time, and in all newsrooms, just most newsrooms across the country, the News Directors Association, the National News Directors Association, was meeting in Nashville. So you had news directors from throughout the country, including ours, down in Nashville when this huge story is developing. And how they're going to get back because they'd shut down the airspace.
Right.
So our news director at the time, Patty McGettigan, had figured out with some other local news directors how to get a car rental. They were going to drive back up here, but in the meantime, we had to handle things for ourselves. So it was a lot of confusion, a lot of what do we do next? Network had actually taken over and would take over for the next 2 or 3 days, wall to wall. They gave us little spots to do local news in. And there was a million local stories. I think the one that I went right down to City Hall, which was my beat at the time anyway, and immediately the fire, police department, city management had put together a plan because we didn't know how widespread this thing was going to be. Are they just hitting New York and Washington, or are they going to start hitting smaller communities? And that was a huge fear. So we sat in and listened to some of the plans from the city, and just waited for the next shoe to drop, really. And that's what you felt like for those next probably week or so. When's the next shoe going to drop? What's going to happen next? And that was a frightening part about it. One of the more frightening parts about it.
Right. And I think that is something that kind of gets lost when we do think back to that time, or when we do have these long conversations about just what it was like back then, because a lot of attention, and rightfully so, does immediately go to New York, to Washington, D.C. But this really impacted everybody across the country, in all parts of the world, really. And I guess, just kind of for maybe the younger audience, because I have run into a few people that were born after 9/11 even happened, so they really don't even remember. And even me, being a young kid, really hard to kind of remember some of those big things that happened. But you, being a journalist and having all of these questions going on, I can't imagine what that was like. And like you said, network was cutting in a lot of the time. You guys weren't able to produce newscasts. What was that, I guess, situation like for you personally, having to have all these questions, but also realizing you have a job to do to inform everybody and do that job as best you can, given the circumstances?
Pete Hamill's late Pete Hamill was a New York City columnist, and he had a quote that said, news, if it's done right, is history. And that's what clicks in your mind. You need to tell the story. You need to preserve history. At that point, and most, I don't know if a lot of journalists consider themselves historians, but that's kind of always been my take on it. If you got to preserve these stories for future generations. And a lot of that went into our reporting. Somebody your age who was, so young at the time needs to know the impact, as my parents taught us the impact, and our teachers when I was going out through school taught us the impact of Pearl Harbor, the Holocaust, all those things. We were taught that impact, so mainly try to avoid it in the future. But that was one of the more important aspects of our reporting that time. Take the local stories, how they're impacting people, so people in future generations in Grand Rapids and West Michigan can relate to what we were going through that day.
Mm-hmm. And now 24 years later, Joe, is there one story that you were able to tell, or saw, the newsroom really come together and be able to tell some of these stories that is always going to really stick out to you? You mentioned just kind of how all of these first responders were sort of gathering to maybe head on out to New York or figure out how this was going to impact us here in West Michigan. Any story that you can really think about that is just always going to kind of sit with you, just whether it was that day or the days afterwards, or even a couple of weeks afterwards, because again, this really did impact and have a long-lasting impact.
There were so many stories, and I remember at one point in the afternoon when the city was having one of their briefings, the police chief at the time was from New York City, and I knew he had siblings that were on the job there. And I asked him, I waited until the end of the news conference because I wasn't sure how his reaction would be, and I pulled him aside and said, look, I know you got family there. Can you talk about that? Have you heard from them? And his answer was, look, we got a job to do here. We got to concentrate on the city of Grand Rapids, keeping it safe, letting people know what we're doing to keep it safe. Let's concentrate on that now, not my personal. Everybody from his family was okay eventually, but that was the focus from in communities all through the country, especially these first responders. We need to keep our communities safe. We need to make sure all the safeguards are in place and we're on our toes, waiting again for that other shoe to drop. That impressed me, impressed upon me the importance of keeping everything local too. And I can tell probably a dozen other stories throughout that next 2 weeks that of people impacted. The firefighters going to the grocery store, and all of a sudden, random people walking up and giving them a hug. Stories like that. I got a call from the Grand Rapids fire chief at one point, a week or so after, and said, hey, I think we're going to have a big memorial service at one of the large churches in the area. Could Channel 8 help us? Well, that was a no-brainer. My boss at the time, I went and talked to her about it, and within a couple of days, we helped with the organization mainly so we could cover it on TV, because a lot of the first responders were still working in Grand Rapids. They were working their shifts. So we made sure we could put it on one of our channels so they could all see it as well and be part of it. Again, I could tell probably a dozen stories of that time that I still think of, especially this time of year.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And again, one thing I did want to ask you, Joe, just personally, I mean, we know probably better than a lot of other people who are going to be watching this, just how the news cycle works and how things kind of get picked up for about 24 hours of the focus of the newscast, and then people can check it out on the website later. But there's always something new to kind of pick up on and focus in on here at News 8. But going back to that, with a story of that magnitude, a historical event like you said, and having to be the ones to not only cover it, but make sure that people for years to come can also check it out and learn from it as well. I guess I just wanted to ask you, personally, when did things really start to kind of maybe go back to normal, or did they ever really go back to normal beforehand?
Yeah, and I don't know if normal was the new normal,
right?
If you remember that term, because once they, in the months after 9/11, you had the anthrax scares, so that had everybody on their toes. You had the holiday season where, do you really want to celebrate? Because we had this national tragedy. So it took a long time, I'd say a couple of years, to get back into, the news cycle started over again soon after, but to really get that back to more of a normal pace where you're not always worried about, again, the other shoe dropping, that took a long time.
I think that is something that really needs to, again, get shed to light a little bit more, because like I said, we spend so much time focusing on those attacks, but really, there was so much that really expanded from that, and again, still has a legacy here in the United States. We think about every time we go to the airport and deal with TSA, well, that stemmed from those terrorist attacks. So again, it's still 24 years later, touching really all different parts of our lives still today.
Well, and you talked about moments, and that's one I always remember too, is the week after being out to the Ford Airport and seeing National Guard troops getting off a bus and marching into the airport, and never thought I'd see anything like that in my lifetime, and here it was.
Right. All right. Well, Joe, again, we do appreciate you stopping by today and giving us a look back at that fateful day 24 years ago. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And today, of course, is just such an important day, and we are going to be spending the entirety of today here at News 8 commemorating the 24th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. I want to thank Joe for stopping by and just expressing and kind of reliving what that day and stretch of time was really like. Again, we do have live streams of those formal ceremonies happening both in New York and in Washington, D.C. happening right now. You can check them out over on our website, woodtv.com.